Joy of Life Chapter 0. Introduction. In a family that accumulates goodness, blessings shall follow. Embrace these blessings, embrace them, and suddenly meet a benefactor. Grateful for one's mother, accumulating hidden merits. Advising others in life, assisting those in need. But who can know that in this world, while one may inherit blessings, in the end, they must make their own path and choices, as it is said, forks in the road arise. The east wind carries clouds and rain, young vines sprout new shoots. Urgency resembles a furrowed drum, washing away fluff and splendor. Await the arrival of the morning sun, greenness spreads across the courtyard. Anticipate the time of yellow leaves, harvesting several melons. In today's world, thousands of paths diverge, but only flattery knows no bounds. Because the story unfolds in the nation of Xian, and that particular patient extravagantly possesses an extra fragment of life, hence the title, Xian Yunyan, a name rich in rural flavor. Asterisk, the word Yunyan signifies remaining years of life, while the first word Xian is chosen because our protagonist was born in a nation named Xian. Volume 1. In the continent of Dan. Xian struggled to keep his eyelids open, trying to count the meaningful things he had done in his life. However, before he could count all the 5 bony fingers on his right hand, which had become as thin as chopsticks, he sighed deeply and sadly gave up the task. The hospital room was filled with the pungent smell of medication, just as it had been for days. The old man in the bed next to his had already departed to the underworld a couple of days ago, and it seemed like it would soon be his turn. He had contracted a strange illness, myasthenia gravis, a disease that would make a perfect male lead in a romance novel. They said there was no cure, and in the end, on the day he couldn't even pass gas, he'd be completely paralyzed, with tears as the only thing he could shed. "But I'm not a male lead in a romance novel," Xian mumbled, though due to the loss of muscle control in his jaw, it came out as a vague murmur. He looked at his middle finger and felt a strange sympathy for himself. "I'm still a virgin." In his entire life, Xian hadn't really done anything meaningful. Apart from helping elderly ladies cross the road, giving up his seat on the bus, getting along with his neighbors, and assisting his classmates in cheating on exams, Xian was what one would call a traditionally useless good guy. His parents had passed away a long time ago, leaving him all alone in the hospital, waiting for the day when his life would come to an end. Good deeds don't bring any rewards. In a quiet night, Xian felt as if he could clearly sense his throat muscles slowly relaxing, unable to tighten again. His respiratory muscles, like rubber bands losing their elasticity, were spreading out weakly. The clean little nurse from the hospital seemed to have disappeared somewhere, and next to him was a middle-aged woman who was talking incessantly, her eyes filled with sympathy and pity. "Is this what it feels like to die?" The fear of death and the longing for the taste of life flooded him with complex emotions he had never felt before. To be met with his end by this older lady, and not the lovely nurse he had been hoping for, undoubtedly deepened the melancholy in Xian's heart. Melancholy and desolation, he hung his head low and stared at the piece of black cloth covering the window, which blocked out the sunlight, making him feel that life was as lonely as dog excrement. In a dismal and pitiful state, a wet droplet slid from the corner of his eye. Xian felt somewhat sorrowful. He extended his tongue and licked the liquid that had slid from his eye to his lips. To his surprise, he discovered that his tears were not only salty but also carried a faint hint of something fishy. Could it be because he hadn't bathed much in the hospital, causing even his tears to emit an unpleasant odor? He couldn't help but curse silently in his mind. "You were told not to cry so dramatically. Did you really think you were the male protagonist in a romance novel?" However, he quickly realized that something was amiss. Why was he able to extend his tongue to lick his own tears when the doctor had said his tongue had long lost its mobility? Currently, its only purpose was to easily slide into the esophagus, effectively blocking his airway, potentially making him a rare genius in the world of self-inflicted tongue-swallowing suicide. Then he noticed that opening his eyes had also become easier. His field of vision was wide, and his eyesight had improved significantly compared to when he was ill. In front of him lay a scene of clarity, where a structure made of woven bamboo pieces was right in front of his eyes. While he was lost in thought, Xian suddenly saw a shocking scene through the gaps between the bamboo pieces. There were over a dozen individuals dressed entirely in black, emanating a strong sense of hostility. They were brandishing sharp weapons and charging towards him. In that instant, he had no time to distinguish whether this was a dream or a bizarre experience before death. Instinctively, he tucked his head and covered his face with both hands. Anyone else in his situation would likely make the same ostrich-like choice. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Countless sounds of cutting through the air filled his ears. Following that were numerous muffled grunts, and then a silence enveloped the area. After a while, Xian felt that something was amiss. He cautiously separated 2 fingers from the hand that was covering his face and glanced outside. The structure made of bamboo pieces divided the space in front of him into countless compartments. Through these gaps, he could clearly see over a dozen lifeless bodies lying on the ground, surrounded by spilled blood, and the stench of it filled the air. Xian was terrified. Everything he saw before him was so vivid that he couldn't come back to his senses for a moment. Then he suddenly thought of his own hands on his face. Could his hands move now? Had he really been cured of his illness? What was the meaning of all this before his eyes? Could this all just be a dream? Would he still be the same bedridden and helpless invalid waiting for death once he woke up? If it's really like that, then it's better not to wake up in this dream. At least I can move my own hands and blink my own eyes. He thought with some sadness as he touched his wet face with his hand. When he withdrew his hand, he found that it was covered in blood. It turned out that the wet liquid that had dripped from the corner of his eye earlier was actually blood that had splattered onto his face, though he didn't know whose blood it was. Xian stared blankly at his own hands and cried out in his heart, "These definitely aren't my hands." In front of him were a pair of extremely fair and adorable little hands, stained with blood. They looked like a sinister white lotus blooming in a battlefield, definitely not the hands that an adult should have. A series of emotional shocks rushed into Xian's mind all at once, leaving him in a daze. Countless questions and overwhelming fear took over his body and mind. This year is the 57th year of the Qing dynasty. The emperor leads a large army in the ongoing war against the Western barbarians. The Duke of Xian is also accompanying the army, while the capital is governed by the Empress Dowager and the Council of Elders. On this day, a fire broke out at the Taiping Monastery by the Lujing River on the outskirts of the capital. A group of nightmarish assassins took advantage of the chaos, rushing into the monastery and killing anyone they encountered, committing a shocking massacre. One young servant from the monastery managed to escape with the young master during the night, but they were pursued by a group of assassins dressed for stealth. The pursuit led them southward out of the city, and the ambushers had no idea that this disabled young boy was actually a formidable warrior. Behind the hills, they discovered reinforcements for the boy and even more terrifying presence that left them terrified. "The Black Knight," cried the assassins who had been shot down by crossbow bolts, lying in pools of blood. The reinforcements were mounted on horses, clad in black armor that glistened under the moonlight, emitting an eerie and soul-devouring aura. Each of them wielded heavy crossbows that were only issued to military units, and their rapid fire had already taken down most of the killers. Among the escort of the Black Knights, there was a middle-aged man sitting in a carriage, his face pale with a few sparse strands of beard on his chin. He watched the young servant carrying the child and nodded in approval, then lightly clapped his hands. The applause was the signal to attack. A detachment of cavalry, like scythes in the dark night, charged mercilessly into the severely wounded group of assassins. Suddenly, one of the assassins, a mage, raised his staff and began chanting an incantation. Everyone in the area could feel an unknown energy gathering on the outskirts of the hills. The middle-aged man in the carriage raised an eyebrow but didn't make any immediate move. However, a dark figure darted out from his side, swiftly gliding through the night sky like a hawk. With a sharp sound, the mage's incantation abruptly stopped, and his head soared high into the air, blood splattering like rain. The middle-aged man in the carriage shook his head, saying, "These mages from the West never seem to understand that their magic is useless against true power." Dozens of black-clad cavalrymen confirmed the safety of their surroundings, clenched their fists, and made a gesture signaling that the assassins had been dealt with. The cavalry split apart, and the carriage continued to advance slowly, reaching the young servant. With the assistance of his subordinates, the middle-aged man in the wheelchair got out of the carriage. He had difficulty walking due to his disabled legs, but he approached the young boy carrying the child, who had stood steadfast like a spear in the middle of the chaos. Looking at the bamboo basket on the boy's back, the man in the wheelchair's pale face finally showed a hint of relief. Fortunately, nothing happened. The person with the black cloth bandage over their eyes, carrying a sword-like black iron spear, and with blood dripping slowly from the spear, nodded. Many dead bodies lay around them, all skilled assassins. There were traces of blood on the corpses' throats, indicating that they had been killed with a single fatal blow. "I need an explanation for this," the person with the black cloth over their eyes said coldly, without a hint of emotion in their voice. The middle-aged man on the wheelchair, his face showing a fleeting expression of tenderness, replied, "I will provide you with an explanation, and I must also give one to my master." The person with the black cloth bandage nodded and prepared to leave. "Where do you plan to take this child?" The middle-aged man in the wheelchair asked coldly. "You are blind. Are you going to let the young master wander the world with you? This is the young Mrs. Flesh and Blood. It's also the master's flesh and blood," the middle-aged man on the wheelchair said coldly. "I promise to find a safe place for the young master within the capital." The blind youth shook his head. The middle-aged man knew that aside from obeying the young lady's orders, the blind youth wouldn't listen to anyone else, not even his own master. He sighed and tried to persuade him, "The matters within the capital will be settled once the master returns. Why must you take him away? I don't trust your master." The middle-aged man frowned slightly, seemingly displeased with this statement. After a short pause, he said, "Can you do things like feeding a child and teaching him to read?" "Blind one, aside from killing, what else can you do?" The blind youth wasn't offended and lightly pushed the bamboo basket on his back. "Lame one, it seems you can only kill two." The middle-aged man smirked. "The targets I dealt with this time were just the nobles from the capital. When the master returns, I will start cleaning them up." The blind youth shook his head. The middle-aged man's hand gently stroked the wheelchair, as if trying to guess what the blind youth was afraid of. After a moment, he furrowed his brow and said, "I know what you're afraid of. But in this mundane world, besides the child's father, who has the ability to protect him from unknown dangers?" The blind youth suddenly spoke, emotionless as ever, a new identity, a life undisturbed. The middle-aged man pondered for a moment and then nodded with a smile. "Where to?" "Danzhou Harbor. The master's mother currently resides there." After a moment of silence, the blind youth finally accepted the arrangement. The middle-aged man smiled as he wheeled his chair around to the back of the blind youth. He extended his hands and gently took the child from the bamboo basket. Looking at the child's adorable face, as beautiful as a carved ice sculpture, he sighed, "Looks exactly like his mother. So beautiful." He suddenly burst into hearty laughter and exclaimed, "This little guy is bound to achieve great things when he grows up." His subordinates in the distance stood in silent astonishment. Hearing their leader burst into such cheerful laughter, although his expression remained unchanged, they couldn't help but feel deeply shocked. They had no idea just how important this little child was. The blind youth tilted his head slightly and reached out to take the child back. Although he was more innocent than the average human, he didn't want the infant's face to be too close to the hands of this viper. With a single monosyllabic word, he politely expressed his question. The middle-aged man smiled, still looking at the child's face. In his smile, there was an indescribable, unsettling quality. A 2-month-old baby who can wipe away the blood from his own face and sleep so soundly after experiencing such a terrifying night. Truly worthy of being. His voice suddenly dropped very low, ensuring that his subordinates couldn't hear the words he uttered next, "The child of a celestial lineage holder." This middle-aged man held great power in the capital, and his methods were ruthless. Any official who fell into his hands would confess the truth within 2 days, and his insight was sharp. However, even such an extraordinary figure failed to discern that this child wasn't peacefully asleep but had been frightened into unconsciousness. Celestial lineage refers to the bloodline left by the heavens in the mortal world. In the legends of this world, every few hundred years, a bloodline left by the heavens awakens. This bloodline can potentially represent formidable and uncontrollable power, like the general in the distant Nazca kingdom who, at a critical moment when the nation was on the brink of being destroyed by barbarians, single-handedly assassinated most of the members of the barbarian council with his bravery and strength. Some celestial lineage individuals may manifest extraordinary talents in arts or intelligence, such as the Western mage Bull and his playwright wife Fubo, who passed away just 300 years ago. Naturally, no one can prove that they are the chosen ones favored by the heavens, leaving their bloodline behind. However, in reality, these individuals have brought peace and many other things to the mortal world. All celestial lineage individuals eventually vanish without a trace. No one, not even a nation, can detect their presence. They simply appear suddenly and disappear just as suddenly. Apart from some obscure records, they leave no tangible proof of their existence. The middle-aged man sitting in the wheelchair happens to be one of the very few who knows that such phenomena as celestial lineage indeed exist. For some unknown reason, after Xian died, his soul came to this world in an astonishing way, reincarnated into the body of an infant, and it turns out that the father or mother of this infant is none other than the mysterious and enigmatic celestial lineage on the continent. As dawn broke, the battlefield had been cleaned up, and the carriage slowly moved onto the stone road leading eastward. Behind the carriage, a squad of black-clad cavalry and a pale middle-aged man in a wheelchair created a rather eerie scene. The carriage bumped over some stones, jolting the infant who had been lying peacefully on a soft silk cushion. The infant's unfocused gaze left the faces of the people who had saved their life and fixed on the front of the carriage. Unlike an ordinary infant whose gaze would wander, their eyes were exceptionally clear but couldn't seem to focus, exuding an inexplicable and indescribable aura. No one knew that within this tender little body, there resided a soul from a different world. As the gaze shifted, the carriage curtain fluttered in the wind, revealing a glimpse of the green mountains outside and the long stone road that retreated into the distance, like countless frames of pictures endlessly rewinding. Ahead of the carriage, the blind youth tightly gripped the iron spear in his hand, a piece of black cloth covering his eyes, veiling his vision of the world.